I bought this for $20 5 years ago. So, hey, why not? Let's talk about it now so then I can actually make use out of this thing because you know damn well I didn't play it. The PlayStation Classic. Ooh, boy. Kind of almost forget this thing even existed, man. I mean, like, this was such a huge announcement when it was initially revealed back in 2018. You know, just the fact that, hey, Sony is doing the same thing Nintendo did. To a T. I almost feel like they were a little too on the nose with this, calling it just straight up the PlayStation Classic. So Nintendo introduced the NES Classic Edition back in 2016, and then we have the SNES Classic Edition in 2017. And then in 2018, Sony just says, all right, well, let's do the exact same thing they did and still call it the PlayStation Classic. At least when Sega did it with the Sega Genesis Mini, they went with, you know, calling it Mini. I believe in Europe, the NES Classic Edition was called like the NES Mini, and same in Japan, it was called like the Famicom Mini. So, you know, I mean, whatever. Like, it's not like Sega's completely off the hook for like, oh yeah, you know, they ripped off Nintendo there. But at the same time, Nintendo pretty much ripped off stuff like Atari with the Atari flashback consoles back in like 2004. So, you know, I mean, plagiarism, who gives a shit? At the end of the day, I don't really think Nintendo owns the concept of re-releasing a smaller version of one of their previous home consoles. But, you know, let's be honest, the only reason Sony did this was because, you know, Nintendo did it and there was success. I love PlayStation, man, but, you know, like, I just feel like Sony is at their most embarrassing when they try to do a Nintendo thing, but worse. I just thought it was funny. I remember when the PS4 was getting teased to get revealed, like Sony had this big PS4 event in early 2013, and I remember there being like little Google ads popping up where, you know, Sony was kind of like making fun of Nintendo with the Wii U. Now, of course, this might not have been actually Sony doing this. This could have been just some random fan who had like some Google ad credits. I don't know, but I remember the Google ads reading something like, oh, yawn, another Mario game. Stay tuned to the PlayStation event to see the future of gaming. And I'm just thinking, like, motherfucker, in 2012, like, what? You had PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, literally just like Sony completely copying the concept of Smash Brothers. And then you also had Little Big Planet karting, which is literally just Sony going like, yeah, f it, let's just do a Mario Kart thing for Little Big Planet because we want Little Big Planet to be like our Mario. And I just feel like they just added a bunch of random shit into the PlayStation Vita because Nintendo had a bunch of stuff like it in the 3DS. Like, you know, the Vita had like AR cards included. What the hell was that about? Then they had like that service called like Nier, which I feel like was just like them trying to do like a Street Pass thing. And I'm just like, none of this is why people are buying a PlayStation Vita. So I'm just like, why are we trying to compete with Nintendo so vigorously here by like trying to like just do exactly what they're doing here? You know, I think an easy one to point to would be like the PlayStation Move, but you know, like I think the PlayStation Move kind of carved out its own little niche. You know, like, yeah, it was better than the Wii Remote and Nunchuck in most ways. But at the same time, you know, you look at something like Xbox 360 with Kinect, and that was definitely trying to do a little more of its own thing. And with the PlayStation Move, that, I mean, like, you look at the PlayStation Move controller and the navigation controller, and compared to a Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and you're just like, oh, yeah, Sony was just trying to do, like, Nintendo's thing. But what I'm trying to get at here is PlayStation has consistently been the king of video games. I mean, like, just straight up, you know, Nintendo is so easy to just be like, oh yeah, they're the king of video games. But no, like, ever since PlayStation hit the scene, like, they have hit it out of the park with nearly every single one of their consoles taking home like #1 spot for like, yeah, they sold the most consoles that generation. In my opinion, it's like, damn, like, they know what the hell they're doing. Which just makes it really embarrassing when they try to copy Nintendo because, again, like, they always just, they don't care when they do it. They half-ass it and they expect it to yield the exact same results. Case in point, bingo. The PlayStation Classic. Man, this was the laughingstock of 2018. You know, like, when this was first announced, I think a lot of people were, like, really excited. But then as more info just kept on getting revealed, it was pretty obvious that, like, yeah, like, this isn't where we want it. So, a brief history on retro mini consoles up to this point. Like I said, you know, like we've had stuff like the Atari Flashback consoles and Intellivision Flashback, ColecoVision Flashback. Then you have like these little mini Sega Genesis consoles. And some of these things weren't bad. They were actually pretty cool. I think a lot of the Atari ones were very novel for the time, you know, especially, you know, the first Atari Flashback consoles launched in like 2004. And for the time, you know, this was like one of the first instances of like, oh man, let's tug at these nostalgic heartstrings for these old school video game consoles. You know, you buy this cheapo console that just plug and play into the TV and bada bing, bada boom, you're golden. Incredibly novel for the time. And for what they were, they did the job. But the quality always varied, and these didn't necessarily feel like they were meant to be like these incredibly premium products that were meant to celebrate a console in its entirety. They kind of just felt like, hey, we have the license from Atari to make like a cool little like plug and play console. You know, let's just do it. The Sega ones especially have always been kind of, you know, crappy. But in 2016, Nintendo introduced the NES Classic Edition, and I just feel like that was kind of one of the very first like plug-and-play mini retro consoles that really went for like a truly quality experience, kind of like this one-stop shop for like, hey, like this is the NES, and it's coming back, baby. 30 games included, and these are just genuinely like the 30, like, oh, these are definitive NES games. They're not just including just whatever the hell they can or whatever the hell they want. Like, they went for NES games that defined the console. The emulation quality was sublime. The controllers were great. They were perfect representations of the original NES controllers. You have some extra quality of life features like save states and whatnot. And, you know, just the presentation was just out of this world. You know, the build quality of the little mini NES was great. The menu system had like this unique menu theme that's like one of the best menu themes out there. You know, it uses like the old school NES style, and it just sounds like it's like a song ripped directly from that era. It sounds amazing. Yeah, the NES Classic Edition was wonderful. You know, like obviously it does have some flaws. You know, for some reason the NES controller length was like, you know, like a nickel in length. But overall, it was a $60 console. Like, yeah, it's pretty damn good for what it was, man. So damn good, Nintendo did it again the very next year with the Super Nintendo. And at this point, pretty much all these retro game companies were kind of scrambling to be like, oh damn, well, we should do this too. So you have Sega coming out with the Sega Genesis Mini, TurboGrafx 16 Mini, Neo Geo, the Commodore 64 Mini. Like, it was just non-stop, man. But many of these did feel a bit rushed. Like, you know, a lot of these companies that, you know, looked at themselves and they were like, oh, well, we own the rights to this classic video game console and a good chunk of its catalog. Why don't we do a mini console re-release? And they just kind of like, you know, just pumped it out. And in some cases, like, they realized like, oh yeah, the whole appeal of this mini console thing is the fact that this is kind of like a finely crafted little product. I think Sega realized that because Sega initially announced like, yeah, we're doing a Sega Genesis mini console. And they announced that At Games was doing it. And At Games is just very notorious for being like really just bad. They've done a ton of these like crappy little plug and play mini consoles before, and people were like, oh my god, this is gonna suck. So much so that Sega said, all right, we're gonna delay this, we're gonna do this right. And they did. Like, the Sega Genesis Mini is honestly like one of the best mini consoles out there. On an unrelated note, yeah, the PlayStation Classic felt like a bit of a cash grab, something where Sony thought, hey, why don't we try something like this? So, you know, they kind of pumped this out, and it feels a bit rushed, man. It always felt a bit rushed. Like, they were like, we just want to get it out this holiday season. Let's just do this. Which is weird, man, because you look at this thing, and it's like, yeah, the box is incredible. This device looks phenomenal. Even take it out of the packaging, and like, yeah, this is exactly what you'd want it to be. This works. This is great. So what the hell went wrong with this thing? Well, you know, let's go over the 7 deadly sins. Number 1, the PlayStation Classic was $100. Now, of course, let's be honest, the PlayStation era of gaming, is definitely, a bit more modern than a lot of the mini consoles that we're used to seeing, Genesis, Super Nintendo, NES. This is definitely taking things up a notch. But when you're at $100, I feel like we're kind of, I feel like we're kind of expecting a much better, quality product here. And, that's kind of the problem. The game selection kind of failed to impress a lot of people. So let's go over these. So you get 20 games included, which is roughly in line with like the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. The NES Classic Edition had 30 games. SNES Classic Edition had like 21. And it's like, damn, the Super Nintendo can only really do like mostly 2D games. So it's just like, this is giving you all kinds of things. Pretty damn good. Well, let's go over these. So we got Battle Arena Toshinden, Cool Borders 2, Destruction Derby, Final Fantasy VII, Grand Theft Auto, Intelligent Cube, Jumping Flash, Metal Gear Solid, Mr. Driller, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, Rayman, Resident Evil, Revelations Persona, R4, Ridge Racer Type 4, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Siphon Filter, Tekken 3, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, Twisted Metal, and Wild Arms. Who cares? This isn't a bad lineup of games, but, a lineup indicative of the PlayStation 1 in general, it just feels really lacking. This feels very much kind of like they just went with what they could, So, I think stuff like, okay, so you got Final Fantasy VII. That's great. Grand Theft Auto 1. That's cool too. Thing is, I don't really feel like Grand Theft Auto is like 100% necessary, at least until you get to like Grand Theft Auto 3. So if you're doing like a PlayStation 2 Classic Edition, I feel like, Grand Theft Auto 3 would be a must. Not really sure how much Grand Theft Auto 1 on PlayStation would be a must, but it's still cool that's there. Metal Gear Solid, of course you need Metal Gear Solid. Resident Evil, that's a big one. Tekken 3, another big one. Rayman 1 honestly feels a little weird. I think Rayman 2 would have been kind of the bigger inclusion. Rayman 2, a 3D platformer. I feel like more people played Rayman 2. But it feels like we have a lot of things missing that were like these iconic parts of the PlayStation's identity. Obviously, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Tomb Raider. Like, where the hell is Gran Turismo? Where's Castlevania Symphony of the Night? You have Resident Evil. Where's Silent Hill? What about, like, Wipeout 2097? Parappa the Rapper. And that's just scratching the surface. And I think that's what makes, like, Nintendo mini consoles a lot easier to, like, pick these games for compared to, like, PlayStation. Because, PlayStation has always been kind of the jack-of-all-trades console, Everybody had a PlayStation. And it's because there's, like, thousands of games available on each and every PlayStation console out there. Problem with that is, like, hey, everybody's game collection is going to be different. You take two people that own a PlayStation 2, and they're completely different. They live completely different lives. They have completely different games. You take two people who own a Nintendo Switch, and they're probably gonna have, like, 20 damn things in common. I feel like it's definitely a lot easier to just kind of, like, narrow in on, like, a definitive list of, like, 20 Super Nintendo games compared to, like, 20 PS1 games, especially if you have to like get the licenses for them and include them on like this one mini console product. So hey, I do want to bring up that like, yeah, I do understand that like license agreements and all this nonsense, that can definitely kind of make this trickier. But does it? I mean, Sony had Konami on board, they published Metal Gear Solid. But they also published Silent Hill, so it's just like, why isn't Silent Hill included? Hell, you got Namco on board. They do Mr. Driller. Why not Pac-Man World? That seems like a pretty easy, safe bet. Hell, with Ubisoft, you got Rayman. So Rayman 2, why not? This isn't a bad lineup of games, but I'm gonna be perfectly honest. It's kind of boring. I'm not really looking at this lineup and getting like overly excited. And that also might be because like the PlayStation 1 era, doesn't always age the best, especially when the emulation quality is lame. That was another big problem with the PlayStation Classic. The emulation ain't all too great. The games don't look as good as I really think they can. I mean, like, you know, obviously this is different from like a PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, but compare how PlayStation 1 games look on the PS5 to this. Okay, to an extent, the PlayStation Classic does look a little more like how the original PlayStation 1 looked in my mind. The PS5 kind of like smooths things out a bit, but at least when it comes to like just the image quality, like I'm like, it just feels a lot more like lower res and blurry on the PlayStation Classic, which is fair because it is lower res. It's like, you know, it caps out at like 720p on here, which is fine. You don't need 4K for these games, but at the same time, I'm like, when I'm paying $100 and like, oh, out of the 20 games, one of them is fucking Cool Borders 2, I expect a little higher quality. But you don't get that. You get European ROMs. Yeah, so for example, the game like Tekken 3, when you boot that up, you see like the startup screen show that it's from like, oh, this is from like Sony Computer Entertainment Europe. That's kind of weird. These are a mishmash of like North American releases and European releases. Now, of course, like in most regards, the North American and European releases are like the same. It's not like they're vastly different, except they kind of are, because in Europe, a lot of these games back in the day ran slower. There's this whole thing, you know, here in North America, you know, TVs ran at 60 hertz, which, you know, equates to like 60 frames per second. In Europe, they ran at 50 hertz, which equates to like 50 frames per second. So to make up for that, you know, when a game would release in Europe, they would just kind of slow the game down. So a lot of games from the 80s, 90s, even a bit into the 2000s, ran choppier and slower in Europe. That's crazy. But for some reason, instead of just using all North American ROMs, because at this point, Europe just, you know, like they have 60 frames per second games. It doesn't matter. Like, yeah, it doesn't matter. Some of these games, they use the 50 hertz versions, like Tekken 3, which is a fighting game where you need more pinpoint precision control. And it runs choppier on here than you're probably used to if you played it in North America. Now, why the hell did they do this? I don't know. Maybe because some of these European releases offered more like languages in the games that you could choose from. Okay. But man, at this point, just please, God, tell me, at least, does the menu system look cool? Oh, son of a bitch. This menu is creepy. I mean, like, it's based on, like, the memory card menu of the PlayStation, of the original PlayStation, and, you know, I think that's kind of, you know, that's kind of cool. You know, it makes sense. It's just like, oh, yeah, all these games are preloaded on here, so, of course, you're going through them like it's a memory card. But at that point, I'm just like, just put some damn music on in the background, man. This is abysmal. And on top of that, it doesn't include an AC adapter. What am I supposed to do with this thing? The controllers are perfectly fine controllers, you know. They are, you know, excellent recreations of the original Sony PlayStation controllers. That's the problem, though. They're perfect recreations of the original Sony PlayStation controllers. Why aren't these dual shocks? You know, why don't we have the analog sticks? These always feel, these feel like naked. Obviously, it's to just kind of represent, like, you know, the original form of the PlayStation 1. Which I respect, but to an extent, I'm just like, but come on, man, like, I kind of want the analog sticks. Especially, I mean, like, we do have some 3D games included. It would be nice to just have analog sticks, but, you know, these are fine. They do the job. They are good controllers. Yeah, you know, it's just something that I would have liked. All kind of came together to create just an underwhelming product. I wouldn't necessarily call the PlayStation Classic bad. It's really easy to just dog on this thing because, yeah, you know, it's $100. The game lineup is very disappointing. It's nothing crazy. It feels a little like, you know, they got like 3 heavy hitters and then kind of went for the table scraps, you know. Hey, we got Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII, you know, piss off. But it just feels like there was like a bit of passion to this project, and then it just completely fizzled out like a third of the way through production. They were just like, F it, just get it out there, whatever. You know, we'll see if we can keep moving forward, just like, you know, doing PlayStation nostalgia things. And I think this kind of scared them off from doing more stuff like this. The PlayStation Classic bombed. I mean, like I said at the beginning, I bought mine at Best Buy for $20. Like, this is like one of the most recent products I can remember that was like basically pennied out. It's insane. And I was like, hell yeah, I'll buy this for 20 bucks. Hell, I'd say you're a big ass snob if you're saying like, oh no, I'm still not buying it. It's just like, what the hell is your problem? It's 20 bucks for this thing. You get 20 classic PlayStation games included. These are solid controllers. This is a cute little collectible. If you think the Super Nintendo Classic Edition is worth $80, which is what that retailed for, this is surely worth 20. 100? Hell no. But that kind of brings me to another point as to why I'm kind of thinking like the PlayStation Classic is just underwhelming. I don't think it's bad. These mini consoles are a complete novelty. Like, I love plugging these in and just enjoying them and experiencing them. But, you know, after a couple times, like, you know, I'm not leaving these plugged in forever, man. Like, it's kind of like, all right, that was fun, and then it goes back on the shelf. Like, please tell me, like, do you leave your mini consoles plugged in at all times? I know some of you do for sure, but at the same time, I think most of the people that leave their mini consoles plugged in at all times hacked them. Their NES Classic Editions play literally the entire NES library. Same with the Super Nintendo Classic Editions. Same with the PlayStation Classic. If you hack this, you know, you got the whole PlayStation library on it, or a good chunk of it. So at that point, I have to question, does the preloaded game lineup really matter at all? If you're buying this to leave it plugged in at all times, you're probably gonna hack it. If you're buying this as a cute little collectible, why the hell does the game lineup and emulation quality really matter? It almost feels like something that just kind of helps us sleep better at night. Like, oh my god, I love my NES and SNES Classic Edition because I know they're good quality products. And look at them, they're so cute. The PlayStation Classic, oh, okay, like the build quality of all this is fantastic. It's like an exact replica of the original PlayStation. But the 20 game lineup in it is not what I want it to be. And the emulation quality is so. Yeah, oh wow, horrible product. I will never buy this. I don't know, I just kind of find mini consoles to be like a complete novelty at this point. You know, I just find it a little silly to like really dog on the PlayStation Classic when, like, you know, the games are still perfectly playable, and you know, the 20 game lineup is not perfect and it's not great, but there's some solid games in there. So, you know, if you bought this console at a discount, I think it's a hell of a deal, especially after you hack it, because by God, like at that point, yeah, just hack the damn thing. The PlayStation Classic, in my opinion, is just kind of a mediocre product, you know? Like, I think it could have been a lot better, but it also could have been a lot worse, you know? I think, you know, you can definitely get enjoyment out of this thing. It is a neat collectible. I love the packaging. I love the build quality of all of this, and there are some good games on there. You know, it's not like you're gonna have an awful time with this thing, but I think it's just very deflating and disappointing when you see how much better all these other mini consoles are. And I think it's especially frustrating when you can see that a lot of the biggest problems with the PlayStation Classic kind of come down to the fact that, like, Sony just didn't really care. A lot of its problems aren't really like, oh, well, you know, okay, well, that makes sense. It just kind of feels like they just didn't give a shit. They were just like, who the hell cares? Let's just do the PlayStation Classic. We don't need to include all these other classic games, you know, like, let's just put, yeah, Destruction Derby on there. Why the hell not? But man, I gotta be honest, like, I hope they kind of give it another shot. You know how Sega did the Sega Genesis Mini 2, and it's based on the Sega Genesis Model 2? I think it might be a little cute if Sony does like a bit of a redo on this, and they do like the mini PS1, like the redesigned PlayStation, or hell, they just do this exact thing again, and they include like 30 games, and like all the games you want are included, and the emulation quality is actually tolerable. Because people are definitely really nostalgic for PlayStation history. Problem is, like I said, you know, like you put two people in a room that both own PlayStations, and they're gonna be completely different people. They had completely different game lineups as a kid. So, you know, I mean, like, yeah, somebody will walk into a store, see the PlayStation Classic, go like, oh my God, I remember the PlayStation Classic. Who the fuck is that?